My love, my daughter, before I knew you, before your father, me, and God conceived you, I knew that my body would be your first home. The dark, warm walls of my womb were your tiny body, tiny hands, tiny feet, tiny ears, nose, eyes, and mouth would grow inside of me, would be kept safe from harm. The rhythmic waves of my beating heart would literally beat for you, becoming your electric life force. It amazes me, even now, to think that before I knew you, before I knew your father, God was already making a way for you, making a way for me to find healing with food, to respect my body, to nurture my temple as acts of worship, self-nurture, and resistance. Through my own journey, a journey that started 5 years ago, a journey in search of what is life-giving, not life-depleting, I found a tree of life. Of this tree, I ate that which was good, greens for vitality, root vegetables for strength, herbs for resilience, all for you, my love. Life, an indomitable force that has swept species into existence, a constancy of Earth's legacy, millions of species set in motion at the dawn of time. Birth, this divine and magical experience. Without it, life would not be possible. For all living organisms to enter this plane of existence, birth is the door. The gate that ushers in something familiar, but yet something totally new. Birth is the engine that propels the constancy of life in an ever-changing world. This is a story about the life of me and my husband Jason, where we desired to have a vegan pregnancy. We endeavor to redefine what it means to bring life into this world, to have life and have it more abundantly. But first, to deal with life, we must first deal with death.
There is growing outrage tonight after an unarmed African-American teenager was shot and killed by police in the St. Louis suburb of Ferguson, Missouri.
No justice! No peace! Protesters of different ages and races demanding answers in the shooting death of 18-year-old Michael Brown at the hands of a policeman.
I graduated from Princeton Theological Seminary in May 2014. I felt God was calling me to Philly, so I decided to move there later that summer. 1 week before Mike Brown was killed, and Ferguson became a war zone overnight. I traveled to Ferguson during the Black Lives Matter Freedom Ride and quickly became involved with the activist community in Philly and helped plan some of the early town halls that took place during the aftermath. At the second town hall, there's a pastor who was scheduled to speak that evening on faith and activism. The meeting was about to start and he hadn't shown up yet. So one of the organizers who knew that I preached and had gone to seminary asked if I would speak in his place. That night, I briefly talked about the importance of the moment that we are in as a country and that it isn't a time for faith communities to be silent. I told them that if they were a member of a church whose pastor, whether they were black, white, or a person of color, was silent about racism and white supremacy, they needed to reconsider whether or not they should still be a member of that church.
I first heard Taylor speak at a town hall to address the murder of Mike Brown. She spoke of faith and activism. Those words stuck with me for a few months later. I approached her about seminary. Initially, my interest in her was just about seminary, but when I introduced myself, my interest in her grew. In those months that followed, the death of Mike Brown brought us together. The time and energy we spent in the movement for Black lives was not only a concern about police brutality, but more specifically, the possibility of blackness in the future, of black people existing in the yet to come. I pursued her with the intention of getting to know more about her and for her to get to know more about me. These moments, the time we spent together, sowed seeds that produced love, devotion, and commitment. And when these things reached maturity, we made a vow of marriage before God and our community. We reached the milestone, but we both knew that this was just the beginning.
Several years ago, I came across an article online that talked about how Black and Latino women are more likely to have babies born preterm and at lower birth weights because of stress caused by racism. The article stuck with me, and at the time I was doing a lot of anti-racism and racial reconciliation work and really deepening my understanding of racism as something that was systemic. This was way before I knew about pregnancy, but this was my entrance into the Black maternal health crisis. As someone who studied biology in college and who holds a deep awe for the human body, my mind was simply blown by the idea that racism could affect a mother and her baby on a cellular level.
Among the more than 200 stories ProPublica and NPR collected about Black mothers, inadequate care after birth was a constant theme. When we reviewed Shalon Irving's medical records, we discovered a cascade of complications after birth. Within days, the wound from her cesarean became badly infected. It was treated, but a week later she had to be seen again. The wound wasn't healing well and so painful she couldn't sleep. Reflecting Shalon's mounting distress, her medical records quote her, "It just doesn't feel right." Her legs were swelling until one became bigger than the other, and she was gaining weight, not losing. When a visiting nurse noticed Shalon's blood pressure suddenly spiking, she made another appointment.
And she went in. It was just sort of, oh, that's to be expected. You just had a baby. Don't worry about it.
She was tested for a blood clot. It was negative, and given a new prescription, pills for high blood pressure. But when Wanda looks back now, all she sees is a series of missed opportunities to save Shalon.
Because there is something wrong with this lady. Why not check it out instead of just sending her home? She's got swollen limb. She's not feeling well. She's got high blood pressure. Why wouldn't you put that person in the hospital? She thought they were not paying attention. She did indicate that, they never listened to us.
That night, after her fourth visit in the 3 weeks since she'd given birth, Shalon collapsed.
She just, reached up one arm as if she was trying to grab something, and she just made a gargling kind of sound like she was trying to say something, and passed out.
Paramedics found her without a pulse and not breathing. She never regained consciousness.
Journal entry. Yesterday I began the book, Supernatural Childbirth. So far that book has been both challenging and eye-opening for me. I'm stunned by the family's faith and belief that they could have a completely natural, pain-free labor and delivery and pregnancy. In spite of all the ways that I've seen God move in my life and the life of my family, it's difficult for me to imagine that I too could have a pain-free delivery and labor. Something that really resonated with me in the book was when she mentioned that when you are laboring, you can't rely on anyone else's faith. You have to rely on your own. That God meets us where our faith is. That was a difficult pill for me to swallow. I can't rely on my mother or Jason in that laboring moment. It will be me, God, and our baby. My desire is this, to have a short, painless, natural home birth. My desire is that we deliver a perfectly healthy baby girl. My desire is that God will grow me in my faith and meet me as I take this giant leap. My desire is that I feel the Holy Spirit and God's presence throughout the entire experience. My desire is that when we meet Eve Salome, it is joyful and spiritually rooted. This is my heart's desire. I know that God is all and in all, and therefore can do anything. I slept too much, but I'm glad I got some good sleep.
Yeah. So we're going on in 6 weeks.
Yeah. Blueberry.
Yeah. I'm about to go to the gym. Did I work out wrong? 6 weeks in, after reading pregnancy.
Halfway through our first trimester.
About to go Planet Fitness. Vegan Fit Mom. Are you ready for
7
baby?
months pregnant.
Yeah.
Yeah. Training. Last quarter.
Good.
I have to do a little less as you did to me.
Oh yeah.
Haven't. I said there's the bump. So much of our story, the story of me, my husband, and our baby being born into the world, was a direct response to the reality that faces so many Black families in this country. Our story, the other stories you will hear, is one about choice. Choices within a healthcare system that often leaves Black families the right to make self-determining choices. Many of the choices that my husband and I made during pregnancy and birth were influenced by choices that were made even before I was born. Looking back, so much of how I knew I wanted to mother when the time came was inspired by the way my own mother mothered me and my siblings. It wasn't until I was pregnant that I realized that my formative years were heavily shaped by the fact that my mom was always either pregnant or breastfeeding. I was 10 years old when my brother Caleb, the last one of the bunch, was born, and I remember every other pregnancy and birth before that so vividly. I remember my mom getting nauseous from the morning sickness as she walked me to school and her having to stop to throw up. I remember mommy's hair being really thick and long from all the pregnancy hormones. I remember rubbing cocoa butter on her big, round, brown belly. I remember her wearing my siblings in her carrier. I remember her breastfeeding, so much so that it wasn't until I was much older that I realized that not everyone can or chooses to breastfeed, and that some babies were fed formula through a bottle. What amazes me now is that my mother was my very first example of self-determination. My first example at seeing a woman, a black woman, approach pregnancy and motherhood with confidence and intentionality, choosing to do things that she had no model or example or blueprint, not from her own life or the women around her. Recently, I asked her what prompted her to mother in this way, to give birth naturally, to breastfeed, and to whereas before natural parenting was mainstream, and especially when she had no one to show her how to do so.
You know, by the time we were having children, your father and I had really wanted to go all in, especially me. I'm like, if I'm going to be a mother, I want to be a good mother, and I want to give to my child what I didn't have. And through no fault of my mom, she wasn't in a position mentally to nurture me. And I felt like I knew what I would have wanted, so that's what I had determined I was going to give to you guys. And we didn't have money, but I wanted to give you the best of myself and the best of everything and anything. So, but yeah, I just wanted to give you guys that love and that security. You know, people will say, well, if they didn't see something or if something wasn't modeled for them, that's why they act like that. But for me, I'm like, I knew what I would have wanted as a child, and I just wanted to give that to you guys. Now, I know I went overboard sometime. I could have been a little smothering or like a helicopter parent, but I just wanted to let you guys know that I was there for you.
I think part of it was godly inspiration. God showing my mom a way of bringing us into the world and caring for us when we arrived that was loving and holistic and intentional. I knew that if I was going to be able to do this, if I was going to be able to have a baby, I needed to be in a place where I felt the most safe and where I was around people that I could trust 100%. I didn't want birth to be transactional. I wanted it to be relational. I didn't want to wonder in the back of my mind if a doctor or nurse cared about me or cared about my baby. I knew that I wanted a home birth because I believed that pregnancy could be done differently. It could be done more intentionally. And I wanted to be able to take my time, to not feel like I had to rush. I wanted to be able to eat and drink during labor and have complete autonomy of my movement. I didn't want to feel like I was taking up a bed or taking up resources. And I wanted the safety that comes with being at home. According to the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, women planning a home birth may do so for a number of reasons, often out of a desire to avoid medical interventions and the hospital atmosphere. Food makes up so much of who we are as Black folk. It's so personal and sacred to us. From the grandmother who braided seeds in her hair to Sunday dinners, food has always been personal. So much of who we are has to do with the food that we eat. As Black people in America, we are people of the land, of the soil, of the earth. Our ancestors were stolen and held captive on this land to nurture it, to grow it, to till. Our mothers brought with them seeds of hope, of possibility, and of the future. Okra, watermelon, cowpeas, peanuts, yams, sorghum, and rice. These are some of the foods that we carry from Africa to America. Even the foods that weren't on our land, like collard greens, we cooked into a potent and delectable elixir. The story of American cuisine is etched in the grooves and lines in our hands. With the knowledge of the land and God's help, we made ways out of no ways. Working leaves and roots from the land, we made our own medicine for our aches and pain. Within a context where white folks believed that our only usefulness was our labor, our own root doctors and healers cared about our wellness. I think one of the deepest wounds of slavery in the United States that has yet to be truly tended to on a comprehensive level has been separation from the earth. And as Black people, this is something that manifests itself in so many aspects of our life. The majority of us are only 1 or 2 or 3 generations removed from that connection, either from being enslaved or sharecropping, or growing up in the rural part of the South. This is a wound that is still very much open. It's still gaping. There are so many people that are not aware of our history. So many of our people just simply don't know that we brought agriculture to this country. So much knowledge of so many herbal remedies haven't been passed down these past few generations. There are some young people that want nothing to do with growing food because of the perception that it's slave labor. And even worse, some folks perceive it is a white folks thing. And associating any connection with the earth as being white or European only makes the disconnect more indelible. And it is the fruit of generational trauma. Learning all this information was a huge reason why I decided to continue eating a whole foods vegan diet during pregnancy. What does whole foods mean? I'm talking about when you look at the back of a package or a box of food and it doesn't have a whole bunch of words that you can't pronounce on it. It also means that I focused mostly on fruits and vegetables that are in the produce aisle, and I made most of my meals from scratch at home. I focused on plenty of fruits like watermelon, berries, mangoes, bananas, and apples. Also leafy green vegetables, and lots of beans and legumes like black beans, garbanzo beans, and lentils. Whole grains like quinoa and brown rice, and root vegetables like sweet potatoes, carrots, and beets. And healthy fats too, like avocado, coconut, almonds, chia seeds, walnuts, and cashews. I incorporated herbs like ginger and peppermint, especially when I had morning sickness at the beginning, as well as raspberry leaf and stinging nettle. Some of you may have never heard of these foods before, but they are foods Black folks have eaten and grown for centuries. These whole foods are important during pregnancy because they contain all the vitamins, minerals, and fats that make a healthy baby and keep mom healthy during pregnancy. Diabetes during pregnancy, hypertension, constipation, and hemorrhoids can all be prevented because of whole foods. Real foods set the trajectory for your baby's life. Shannon and Patrick's story of how their son PJ came into the world is one of self-determination and God's grace. At 39 weeks pregnant, they chose the hard road. They made the informed decision to fire their OBGYN, who was trying to force Shannon to get a C-section, while using threatening tactics of intimidation. With the support of a chiropractor, her husband, and her mother, and her steadfast faith in God's sovereignty, Shannon decided that they would receive whatever doctor the ER would assign her when she was in labor.
It was 2 different practices, my high-risk doctor and my OBGYN practice, and the OBGYN was pretty much adamant about, like, no, that's not going to work. And they even sent a nurse in one day, and she pretty much berated me in front of, like, the other nurses. Like, look at her, look at how huge she is. There's no way her baby is not oversized. I wouldn't trust your high-risk doctor because there's no way that they got that correct.
Meanwhile, this nurse didn't do, like, it was a nurse for the hospital, so that
was working with my provider nurse. Those were my provider doctors.
Yeah.
So, you know,
she literally just walked in the door and tried to tell her.
Yeah. And so I already had kind of noticed that it was a push to get me to deliver in the way that I did not think that I was supposed to deliver. Yes.
Listen,
and so when I left at 40 weeks, I was really, really distraught. I was in a lot of pain because I had pelvic symphysis pain, and I just did not know what to do. And so I started researching chiropractors trained in the Webster technique, which I had researched before but never found them. And like I would be on the internet all the time, and I'm like a Google stalker. I can find someone. Couldn't find anyone. The week I walked out of the hospital, I found a phenomenal chiropractor who just basically was like, listen, like, your body's going to hold on to this baby forever if you don't relax, and there's no way for your body to, like, prepare itself if you're in all of this turmoil.
The hospital was totally different. So if I can go back a little bit. So the first hospital that we went to, you could tell that the ethos was different. You know what I mean? And they were really bullying. So I don't know if Shannon explicitly mentioned this. We went to that hospital 3 times, right? We went to the first hospital 3 times. It was 3 times, right?
Yeah, but like
so 3 different times, and each time they tried to push her to induce, and then it was like from our original provider. It was, I always got this feeling like, oh, we're going to do this C-section. Like, this is like, that's what we're doing, and we're delivering at 37 weeks, and we're scheduling C-section, and you're not, like, it was never a question or never a sense that, oh, I'm going, we're going to let you have the birth that you, and
they would say, oh yes, of course, vaginal is always best, but like.
The biggest takeaway that we can learn from Shannon and Patrick's story is that healthcare providers and birth workers work for us. What's convenient for a doctor doesn't matter. A mother feeling safe and supported throughout her pregnancy and in labor is what matters the most. OBGYNs, midwives, and doulas work for the family, not the other way around. I bought books, watched tons of YouTube videos, and read lots of blogs. I educated myself on the differences between a midwife versus a doula, a certified nurse midwife versus a certified professional midwife, how much a home birth would cost compared to a hospital birth or birth center, which was covered by our insurance at the time. I scoured for midwives in our area, especially women of color, and specifically Black ones that did home births. I was stunned, naively so, to find that there were not many in the Jersey and Philly area. 3 to be exact. When I found Asasia's website, I knew her logo looked familiar. I remember driving by her office every day on the way home from work. When I went on her website, I was immediately drawn by the fact that she had Exodus chapter 1 verse 20 right on her homepage. Therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied, and waxed very mighty. For me, that spoke volumes, and as a Christian, I felt I could bring my full self, including my faith, to the experience, and that I wouldn't be ridiculed, but rather encouraged. So I filled out an inquiry form on her website and waited. The fact that she mentioned that particular verse in Exodus also reminded me of seminary. During my first year of seminary, I took Old Testament, and I will never forget that when we were studying the Exodus story, our professors were intentional about making sure that we knew the actual names of the 2 Hebrew midwives, the 2 Hebrew women that disobeyed Pharaoh's order to kill all the Hebrew boys, the Hebrew women that feared God instead of man. These were the women that God used to preserve Moses' life, and in doing so, preserved a whole people. Shiphrah and Puah. These are their names. As someone who grew up in the church my whole life, who had read the Exodus story and was familiar with it, I was ashamed to say I didn't even know that those midwives were actually named in the Bible. Like so many other people, before being forced to remember their names, I cast them off as simply having an important, but still pretty minor, role in the story. I never considered for a minute that exactly 4 years later, there would be another midwife's name that I would come to know, and that would be permanently grafted into my story, our family's story.
That being said, there are still very stark distinctions between being in the medical model and being in the midwifery model, and that is the assumption of what birth is. Is it a social event or is it a medical event, and how do we approach that? I think midwives, being experts in normal birth, have the advantage in working with normal pregnancy and also to help keep low-risk moms low risk so that they can not have to be in the hospital. I don't know if I answered. So I have to always go back a little bit to what brought me to this point, right? I started off in the Baha'i faith and as a young person. And one of the things that we were always taught growing up was to be champions of justice. So ever since I was younger, like from, I would say, 11 into my teenage years, I've always been interested in human rights issues and what can I do to serve humanity. And so my first endeavor in that was to go into advocacy. So I went to school and studied advocacy, African American studies, political science, with the intention of maybe going into law school. And then I became pregnant when I was in college. And just becoming more deeper into my awareness, I realized that the best place to start, like if you're a teacher, if you're a lawyer, you're dealing with people who have a history that started from their conception. So the best way to influence humanity and the world is to start from that primal point. And I think the most important bond in existence is that between a mother and a child, because you have so much power in how you're going to gestate your baby, how you're going to raise your child. So if I can be a medium in that relationship, I feel like that's a very good entrance into, creating a different world. That's why I became a midwife.
In the spirit of Sankofa, which says to know where you're going, you must know where you've come from. We must go back to understand how we got to this reality that has produced these conditions. In a first world society, we have pregnancy conditions for Black women in the United States that are comparable to a third world country. We must explore a brief medical history of how we got to this point. First, the medical industry in general, and second, how those events affected Black communities in particular. The medical profession prior to the beginning of the 20th century is not what it is today. Its accessibility was not rooted in intellectual aptitude and steep financial costs. Men, well mostly white men, from all walks of life could enter the trade regardless of their background. The exclusivity that has characterized the field today was not present before the 20th century. Also not present in the medical profession during this time was the high salary of being a doctor. There was also a lot of concern about the authenticity of doctors in the field, but any discussion surrounding quackery came second to money and status. This all changed when a group of doctors came together. In 1847, the Council on Medical Education formed the American Medical Association, also known as the AMA. In 1867, the AMA ratified a resolution endorsing all members to use resources for influence in legislation to create State Board of Medical Examiners. The purpose was to use state legislators to limit production of medical doctors through the medical boards. In 1873, Dr. Jerome Cochran becomes senator and creates the Alabama Medical Association, which was the main force that helped physicians get into political office for both the House and the Senate. In 1877, the Alabama Medical Practice Act is passed. This allowed county medical societies to act as local boards of health. This act provided a twofold function for medical societies in Alabama. One, it acted as a state board of health to set examples, make laws, and administer laws. And two, it acted as a board of censors / state board of examiners. Following the passages of initial laws, the AMA secretary and editor of the American Medical Association Journal said, and I quote, "Alabama organizations in other states should seek to duplicate." From 1874 to 1915, state legislators enacted over 400 statutes relating to medical practice. In 1881, West Virginia legislation passed legislation that every medical practitioner graduate from a quote-unquote reputable medical college 10 years prior to the act. In 1889, the Supreme Court upheld conviction of Dr. Frank Dent, a doctor who had a diploma from American Medical Eclectic College of Cincinnati, a school not reputable by the state board. In 1896, the New York Medical Society, who practiced their own cases, successfully won cases that brought about broadest definition of the practice of medicine. Prior to this, the definition of practicing medicine was defined by seeking to cure disease through the administration of drugs. One could escape prosecution if they did not administer any drugs to patients. Naturally, there were doctors who utilized other forms of relief through herbal and homeopathic remedies. One by one, these doctors began selectively prosecuting cases that set precedents that would gradually expand the practice of medicine to anyone who seeks to diagnose and cure disease. Increase in legislation did not produce the result that was expected, for it only increased the flow of people into medical colleges. This raised the status of college professors, but did not raise the status of the profession itself, for many did not want working class people going into the medical profession. In 1904, the AMA formed a Council on Medical Education, composed of 5 medical professors from major universities with a permanent secretary, a regular budget, and a mandate to elevate and standardize the requirements for medical education. The Council's first action was to create a minimum standard of education for physicians, increasing the years of medical school and pushing pre-medical curriculum in college. The AMA began grading medical schools based on the records of their students' scores on state licensing examinations. Later extended the evaluation to include curriculum, facilities, faculty, and requirements for admission. They never published this report for fear of causing strife within the medical community, but instead they had someone else do the dirty work. They reached out to another group, the Carnegie Foundation, for the advancement of teaching to conduct a similar evaluation. They accepted their request and tasked a young educator, Abraham Flexner, with the responsibility of this report. The Flexner Report is the final nail of what we now know as the field of medicine, from medical schools to the profession itself. When it comes to the health disparities of Black people, particularly Black maternal mortality rates and Black infant mortality rates, these conditions are better understood through the lens of the Flexner Report. In the late 19th century, there were 14 Black medical schools, but by the release of the Flexner Report in 1910, only 7 schools remained. Flexner recommended the closing of 5 more schools, leaving only Howard and Meharry after the deaths settled in the aftermath of the report. The report, which was 346 pages long, had only 2 pages devoted to black medical schools. The first sentence says, and I quote, "The medical care of the Negro people will never be left to the Negro race." In this report, Flexner seems more concerned with black people not spreading diseases than with them receiving adequate medical training. Inherent in his report about black people is the perception that 1, black people are not capable to care for themselves, and 2, black people possess diseases that can be a danger to their white neighbors. The outcome of the Flexner report negatively impacted the black medical community as a whole, and specifically created more barriers for black maternal practitioners. Poor rural black women didn't have the means to get medical degrees, allowing them to pass the licensing medical boards. This made them increasingly vulnerable to legal scrutiny. When our ancestors were stolen from Africa and brought to this land to be enslaved, they brought with them a vast array of healing practices, including midwifery, as well as during the antebellum period and post-Civil War. These midwives were often referred to as granny midwives, or grannies, because they were often elderly women in the community, informally educated and mostly poor in rural areas. Some were white, but most of them were African American. Many of them came into midwife work as a spiritual calling from God, and they often came from a long line of midwives from their family. Miss Aria Smiley was one of the last midwives to retire in Georgia, delivering almost 1,000 babies during her career in Mitchell County, Georgia. She was a firm believer that her calling was God ordained. In her own words, she said, "I was called to be a midwife by God. If I got concerned about a birth, I'd go to a quiet room and pray. You know, you have to talk to God like he's your friend, and that's how you pray. I'd tell him, now you the one who called me to serve. I didn't come asking, so I need your help." And he would make things all right. You've got to take God with you. Grannies played a significant role in the community, even on plantations. A granny was a safeguard for birthing women. She was a spiritual leader, a healer, a parent educator, a breastfeeding counselor. She was an herbalist and nutritionist. She was a lifeline to the community. Plantation owners saw the value of grannies too. In fact, many employed grannies because it was more frugal than using local physicians who charged for their medical services. In fact, plantations called upon physicians only if there were problems prior to or during childbirth. Some plantation owners even went so far as to hire out midwives to other local plantation owners as a means of acquiring more income. After slavery, granny midwives still provided prenatal and postpartum services to black women. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, medicine became more of a professional field, and it became more white male dominated. White male doctors believed that grannies were medically inept compared to those who were medically trained. They thought they couldn't be trusted because they relied on traditional methods instead of new birth procedures. Most of them also demonized grannies for being spiritual. Granny midwives would be the ones to blame for the death of the mothers during childbirth, especially in the South. This brought about legislation in the early 1900s, legislation designed to either limit the practice of midwifery or eliminate it in its entirety. This birthed the prosecution of granny midwives. By the 1930s, half of births were performed in hospitals. Doctors advocated for stricter medical licensing and more rigorous medical education. And this, of course, negatively impacted granny midwives, many of whom were poor, living in isolated rural areas where they could not come together to fight this kind of legislation.
like chair thing, but all my focus was on you. It was surreal because I'm like, my daughter's about to give birth. And then I remember when Asasia said she didn't like the amount of blood you were losing, and because I was supposed to be talking to you, but I just start praying. Yeah. Because I'm like, okay, nothing's happening to my baby on my watch. What do you mean you don't like the amount of blood? Then what are we going to do? And then I saw it, and I just started praying, and I kept forgetting to like support you vocally. I was like there supporting you physically, but I was praying. And then
I think for me, I'm someone that a lot of people may not know that I can struggle with anxiety and fear. A lot of it is fear of the unknown and wanting a sense of wanting to be in control. And so the whole pregnancy was really like a spiritual discipline, and I really had to level up in terms of my trust in God and getting to the point where I actually had to believe that I could have a good and powerful experience, and that not only believe that that was possible, but believe that also God desired that for me. Baby, you're mommy.
I'm not pregnant anymore. So as soon as you can get a moment.
oh, look at baby. And seeing little Eve, and then Jason was holding her and leaning back, and he had his skin-to-skin time, and I'll never forget that long leg of hers stretching out. I'm like, oh my goodness, it reminded me of your dad's legs. I'm like, where? But yeah, she's. Oh, and I also remember that when because she did her little one eye thing. When she finally opened her eye, my face was right there, looking all into her face. She was like, so I was the first thing that she saw. And of course, Jason noticed that too, because he notices everything.
Great job, B. One more time. Last time.
And then little Eve came out.
Now let's get information. Okay, ladies, now let's get.
I think for me, just the opportunity for people to gain a sense of a strength and confidence to be able to not necessarily just depend on the system to bring a child into the world.
Just what it was like to be able to work with a midwife and to be able to have, like an hour and a half appointments, to have my concerns, heard, to be treated in a very holistic way instead of, my experience with a lot of hospitals has been very quick in and out.
Hey, say happy birthday, mommy.
She's like, why not filming? Like, it's our moment. I know. Vroom, vroom, vroom. Yeah. Say hi. You say hi? No. Say hi.
They're mommy and daddy.
She's like, what's in the noise? Say hi. I'm sorry. She's
okay. It's okay.